Hello and welcome. My name is Thomas, and in this video, we're going to talk about how to get up and running with your own podcast. So over the course of the last 10 years or so, podcasts have exploded. And particularly in the last few years, it seems like just about everybody has a podcast. But what's interesting about that is that although it seems that everybody has a podcast, it's actually very few people who are actually able to start a podcast and then maintain it consistently. Even fewer are the number of people who are actually able to do a podcast well. And as I've learned over the last several years, there's some really basic practical things that you can apply to actually create a podcast that's not only interesting and engaging, but is also very professionally done as well. So the first question you might have is, why should I even start a podcast at all? Why not do a blog or perhaps a YouTube channel? And if you know, if you're familiar with me, obviously you are currently watching this on my YouTube channel, and perhaps and most likely you watch other YouTube content as well. But one of the benefits of doing a podcast is that with a podcast you can be much more long form. You can expound upon topics much more in depth than you can on something like a YouTube video, which can only tend to be anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes really at the maximum in order to make it work. I kind of push that a little bit for a lot of video tutorials. But the great thing about a podcast is that you can go for 45 minutes and you can hold somebody's attention, because while they're doing laundry or dishes, or while they're going on a walk or a jog, or while they're working out, or sometimes even if they're driving, you can actually connect, via Bluetooth to your phone and actually listen within the car speakers. The idea with a podcast is that somebody doesn't have to have a screen in front of them in order to consume the content. They don't have to read the blog. They don't have to watch the video. They can just listen. And for that reason, it has become a very powerful medium. One of the biggest challenges I always hear over and over again, however, for most people who are interested in the idea of a podcast is, you know what, it'd be great to do. I've got some good ideas I've been kicking around, but I have no idea how to tackle the technology. So what I wanted to do is actually put together for you a 4-part video series, and I decided to break it up into 4 parts so that we could focus on individual pieces of creating, of recording, and producing a podcast. And so what we're going to talk about in this very first video, you can kind of think of this as kind of the introduction. In the next few videos, we're actually going to be talking about more of the intricate details and kind of more of a step-by-step tutorial of how to get these things up and running. But in this video, what I want to tackle is something that a lot of other people miss, I think, particularly when they're first getting started. I've gone through a number of different tutorials and I've kind of pieced everything together in order to create my own podcast, The Rightly Show. But a lot of the things that people miss, first and foremost, even if they get the technology down, is what will actually make a podcast successful. So those are the type of things we're going to be talking about in this episode. Okay, so the first thing you want to nail down is your topic or your genre, right? And you want to make sure, and this is the number one mistake, that's why I'm putting it first, you want to make sure that you are extraordinarily specific. You can't be specific enough when it comes to a podcast, because again, there's so many out there. The more specific you can be, the more likely somebody is going to, number one, listen, and number two, stay engaged with the content that you're creating through your podcast. So think of your topic and make sure that it is specific. Number two, you want to make sure that obviously you are well informed and well versed in whatever this topic is. If you're running an online business and you're using this as kind of a way to start kind of building an audience and gaining possible prospects or something like that, then you want to make sure that it kind of falls in line with whatever line of work or market it is that you are working in. But not only should it be something that you are coherent in, you also want to make sure that whatever topic you're choosing, while it does need to be specific, you want to make sure that there is what I like to call a deep well. You want to make sure that it's something that you can pull from continually, that you won't quickly run out of information. Sometimes this can be helpful if you're going to interview people. You need to determine whether this is going to be just you kind of monologuing, and if so, how are you going to keep it interesting and engaging? Are you going to have guests on? Are you going to be able to have more than 10 guests? Because there's sometimes you'll find people out there, who maybe will will decide they're going to do an interview show, but just have a hard time getting enough guests to enable this show to continue over a long period of time. Make sure that whatever topic and format that you choose, it's going to be sustainable. And also, another thing that's easy to overlook as well, make sure that you will maintain interest, because the moment you start losing interest in the podcast is the moment your listeners will start losing interest as well. You have to make sure that it's interesting for you, because if you're genuinely interested in it, then you will naturally be excited about what you're talking about, and that will come across in your podcast episodes. So here's just a quick example from my own podcast that I made recently, and this has come from a lot of trial and error and testing, and something that you can learn from as you're starting your own. You don't have to make the same mistakes I did. So very early on with my podcast, what I was doing was I was fairly generic with what I was covering. So I would talk about specific branding and marketing techniques and tips. And what I was finding is that there's a very select number of immutable brand building techniques that make sense, right? You can only, like if you're going to be teaching the topic of painting, you can only go so far. Once you learn how to paint at that point, what's new, what's relevant. And so from there, I kind of broke out and I started covering news topics. And then what I found from there is that finding news that was relevant to specific brand building techniques or brands in general started to run a little dry. Plus they just weren't as interesting to talk about or to think about. And so then what I decided to do fairly recently was I decided to reformat the show. And so what I never run out of are ideas that are relevant to building a brand. So now what I do for my podcast is pretty much every single episode, I pick a business, whether it's a business that I recently encountered or one that I'm interested in, and then I talk through for 30 to 45 minutes, almost sometimes to an hour, about all the things I would do to improve that business. I call it my audio sketchbook. That's the word I'm looking for. So I call it my audio sketchbook, where people can listen in, because this is actually a big part of what I do with a lot of my clients. I offer a lot of brand building and marketing advice for how to make the customer experience and the brand exceptional. So just recently I talked about a furniture store. So all the different things that I would implement in order to make a furniture store successful, I turned that into an episode. It's useful even if you don't own a furniture store. It's useful to be able to kind of peek behind the curtain and hear kind of the creative process so that you can get little bits and pieces and apply it to your own business. The next thing you need to make sure that you do is that you pick a very memorable name. And what I always recommend, whether this is going to be a business or whether this is going to be a podcast or YouTube channel, try to find the domain first and secure the domain first. So don't think that you have to be super original or clever. Clarity is key when it comes to this. Also, you want to make sure that you can be as concise as possible. You want to make sure, because we're talking about audio here, it's got to be something that you can say and that's relatively easy to spell. So short, concise, easy to say, easy to spell, and that will help you further along than you can imagine with your podcast. The other thing that you want to make sure that you decide as well is what type of brand are you building with this podcast? Are you building a personal brand? At that case, you could just do what I like to call the Your Name Show, right? So you just say, my name's Thomas McGee, so maybe it would just be called the Thomas McGee Show. There's nothing wrong with doing that, so long as you want to make sure that that's the type of brand you're trying to build with this podcast. If you're trying to build a personal brand, that's the way to do it. Otherwise, you probably want to come up with a name that's specific and relevant to the topic that you're covering, because that's going to make it much easier for people to find it and immediately know that this is what this podcast is about. Okay, so once you've gone through the process of determining what is the topic I'm going to talk about, what's going to be the basic show format, is this going to be an interview, is this going to be a monologue, is this going to be something completely different, and you've kind of started to sketch and draw out what these episodes are going to start to look like, then you want to make sure that you have some sort of cover art designed. And I would recommend that you work with a professional designer. If you're on a little bit more of a limited budget, maybe go to something like Fiverr. I'd recommend before going to Fiverr, you probably want to go to something like Upwork. Again, try to find a professional who has in some way worked with other podcast art before, so that they can get you something that's the right size, so that it's going to work. By the way, at the time of this video, you want to make sure that it's going to be about 3,000 by 3,000 pixels a square for your podcast art. Now, if you are really on a budget and you're just starting out, or maybe this is a little bit more of an experiment, the best thing that you can do if you have no other options and you don't want to design it yourself, work with a photographer or even work with someone who's using a smartphone. Try to get the most professional photo of you humanly possible. And yes, I would recommend having a photo of you and just crop that to a square and make that your cover. Not the best solution in the world. If you can get some sort of unique brand that kind of fits you and fits the style you're after, that's going to be best. However, I do recommend using a picture of yourself, because I can tell you from personal experience, as somebody who actually consumes podcasts as well as creates them, it's wonderful to be able to see a picture of the person who you're actually listening to regularly. So make sure that you get a professional photo at the very least. And best case scenario, hire a professional designer to actually put together a podcast artwork piece for you in preparation for going live with your podcast. Okay, so this was just meant to be kind of an introduction. Make sure, if you're not already, make sure that you subscribe to this channel, hit that bell notification so that you get notified every single time we put out a new video, because we're going to have a total of 4 videos in this series. The next video, what I'm going to be talking about is all about the gear, right? So we've once you've gone through the process of narrowing down your topic, determining who your audience is going to be, what your format is going to be, getting those things really squared away, then we need to start talking about gear, because gear does definitely make a difference with the audio quality, which is essential when it comes to a podcast. Nobody likes to hear the scratching and rustling of one of those Apple AirPods or EarPods. You want to make sure that you have a top quality mic and that it's all set up so that it's efficient and easy for you to record your episode. So like I said, the next video is going to be all about gear, and we're going to continue talking about each of the fundamental elements of setting up your own successful podcast. So if you found this useful, as always, hit that like button, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Hey, thanks so much for taking the time to watch this episode of Rightly TV. Be sure to click on one of the other episodes on this page. Plus, head on over to rightly.co, where you'll be able to create a free account, which will give you access to all the videos, the podcast, articles, downloads, and more. Again, head on over to rightly.co, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.